You're alone, miles from civilization, deep in a remote forest where no one can hear you scream. A storm traps you in an abandoned cabin. But as you explore, you discover something horrifying. The door locks from the outside. The windows are sealed. The walls are covered in scratch marks from someone who tried desperately to escape. You realize you're not the first person trapped here, and you won't be the last. This isn't fiction. This is what happened to a man named James, nearly a decade ago, in the Cherokee National Forest, and his story is just the beginning. Welcome to Silent Fear, where we investigate the mysteries that authorities refuse to acknowledge and the encounters that shatter everything we believe about wilderness safety. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to take you through 3 documented accounts of wilderness encounters that defy rational explanation. Real people, real evidence, real terror. These are the cases they don't want you to know about. Case 1. The Cabin Trap. James was 25 years old when he started doing solo backpacking trips. Every few months he'd drive to a remote trailhead, disappear into the wilderness for several days, and come back a different person. His friends thought he was insane. Maybe he was. But for James, the forest was freedom. He'd done this dozens of times without incident. Then came the trip that changed everything. It was the second day of his expedition in the Cherokee National Forest when the weather turned. Dark clouds gathered to the west. James had weathered storms before. He didn't panic. He figured he'd hike through it, same as always. But within 1 hour, he realized this wasn't an ordinary rainstorm. The wind picked up with violent, unrelenting force. The temperature dropped so rapidly that James actually had to stop and add another layer of clothing. When the rain finally came, it wasn't a drizzle. It was a deluge. Trees bent sideways. Branches cracked and fell from the canopy above him like artillery fire. James was wearing a metal-framed backpack. He was hiking at elevation. He was completely exposed. Lightning struck dangerously close. Too close. He needed shelter. Immediately. As he scanned the exposed trail, desperately searching for anything, a rock overhang, a dense tree cluster, anything, he saw it. Through the rain and the trees, partially hidden by the forest itself, was a structure, a cabin, small, ancient-looking, but unmistakably built by human hands. To James, it was a miracle. He practically sprinted toward it and pushed the heavy wooden door open. Inside it was dim, but it was dry. There was a chair, a table, a cot frame against the far wall, a stone fireplace clogged with decades of ash and debris. The air smelled rotten, almost nauseating. James didn't care. He stripped off his soaked clothes and collapsed onto the cold floor, listening to the storm destroy the world outside. He was alive. He was safe. Or so he thought. After about 15 minutes, James's curiosity got the better of him. He grabbed his flashlight and started examining the cabin more carefully. That's when he found them. Scratch marks, dozens of them, covering the walls near the door, some shallow, some carved so deep they'd gouged into the wood itself. No pattern, no order, just frantic, desperate scratch marks. James examined the door mechanism. The handle was a simple latch, but on the outside of the frame there was a metal bracket, clearly designed to hold a padlock. When James opened the door to look, he confirmed what he'd feared. There was no corresponding mechanism on the inside. The door could only be locked from the outside. His hands were shaking now. He turned his attention to the window. The glass was still intact. Surprising, given the cabin's apparent age. That's because there were screws driven into the window frame, one in each corner. They secured it shut. And those screws, James realized, had been driven in from the outside. Around the edges of the frame on the inside were more scratches, deep ones. Someone had clawed desperately at that window, trying to pry it open with their bare hands. All at once, the truth crystallized in James's mind. Someone had been kept in this cabin, trapped, against their will. The realization was sickening, but the storm was still raging outside. The cabin, despite what it implied, was still shelter. James decided to stay. He would spend the rest of his life wishing he'd made a different choice. Time passed. Maybe an hour, maybe longer. The storm didn't let up. If anything, it intensified. The rain on the metal roof was so loud that James had to strain to hear anything else. That's why he almost missed the scratching sound from outside, coming from somewhere along the left wall of the cabin. He thought it might be a branch, but he didn't remember seeing branches low enough to touch the exterior. Then came two heavy thumps on the porch. They weren't storm sounds, they were deliberate, purposeful. James froze. He stared at a random spot on the wall and tried to listen, but the rain made it impossible. His mind raced. Had he heard those sounds, or were there others he'd missed, drowned out by the downpour? His paranoia grew with each passing second. He couldn't bring himself to look at the window. The thought that something might be out there, watching through the glass, was too much to bear. After what felt like an eternity, James began to relax slightly. It was probably just the storm, an animal, nothing to worry about. Then he heard it, pressure against the door. Someone or something was leaning their full weight against it from the outside. The wood creaked. The latch rattled. Then the pressure released. And suddenly, everything clicked into place in James's mind. Why would someone be outside in a raging thunderstorm, circling the cabin, tapping on the walls, without simply coming inside? The door wasn't locked. Nothing was stopping them from entering, unless they didn't want to come inside, unless they wanted him to stay inside. James grabbed his backpack and started shoving items into it with frantic, desperate speed. He had to leave. Now. He didn't care about the storm anymore. He was maybe 30 seconds from reaching the door when he heard the sound of shattering glass behind him. He spun around just in time to see something come through the window. Something solid, something moving, before the entire room erupted into flames. The fire spread with impossible speed. 1 second, darkness. The next second, walls of orange and red and yellow. The heat hit him like a physical assault. The door wouldn't budge. It was jammed from the outside. James threw his entire body against it, once, twice. On the third impact, it gave way. The door collapsed off its hinges and James tumbled through, gasping for air, his lungs burning. He ran wildly, blindly, through the woods, through the rain, trying to put distance between himself and the inferno behind him. But before he could reach safety, something hit him with tremendous force from behind. He was on the ground. Someone was on top of him. James was suddenly fighting for his life, clawing, kicking, screaming. His attacker was yelling too, trying to get a chokehold, gouging at his eyes, pulling his hair. The world spun. James felt dizzy, but adrenaline gave him strength he didn't know he had. He pushed the attacker off and kept running. Behind him, he could hear screaming, maniacal screaming. He didn't stop running until his legs literally gave out. He found shelter beneath 2 fallen trees and collapsed underneath, completely numb. Hours passed. time lost all meaning. Eventually, he forced himself to move. Whoever had attacked him might still be looking. He stumbled onto a random trail and followed it through the night. The rain gradually subsided. By dawn, he had reached a trailhead. The first person he encountered drove him to the hospital. James had second-degree burns on his left forearm and the back of his neck. Doctors told him he was fortunate he hadn't inhaled more smoke. The burns healed over time, but the scars, emotional and physical, remained. When James reported the incident to police, they took a statement but showed little urgency. He wasn't in a charted part of the forest. There was little they could do. And perhaps, they reasoned, no evidence would remain after such a fire. James never told his wife about that night. To this day, she believes he simply matured and became more responsible. She has no idea that her husband survived what appears to have been a premeditated attempt on his life. The cabin has never been found. The attacker has never been identified. And James has never returned to solo backpacking. Case 2. The Fire Tower Mystery. 7 years later, a different location, different witnesses, but another encounter that defies rational explanation. Charles was obsessed with one thing: finding places he wasn't supposed to be. Abandoned buildings, decommissioned factories, forgotten structures scattered across the landscape. His friend, let's call him Marcus, shared his appetite for risk. While most of their friend group would hear Charles's pitches and say, "That sounds insane," Marcus would ask, "When are we going?" It was a dynamic that led to incredible adventures and situations they still couldn't explain. One weekend, Charles found something extraordinary: an abandoned fire lookout tower deep in a remote forest, decommissioned years ago, sitting completely untouched in the middle of nowhere. His pitch: hike to it, climb it, spend the night 70 feet in the air with a 360-degree view of the forest. Marcus agreed immediately. 3 hours of driving brought them to the location. Charles had planned everything meticulously: the drive, what to pack, how to find the tower once they were in the woods. The hike was supposed to be short, roughly 4 miles through dense forest off trail. When they finally saw the tower rising through the trees, Marcus's jaw dropped. It was 70 feet tall, completely unprotected. No fence, no warning signs, no indication that it had ever been secured or restricted. The structure itself was decaying. Railings were bent or missing. Graffiti marked the support beams. The whole thing looked abandoned and dangerous, like it hadn't been touched in decades. But Charles was undeterred. The climb was treacherous. The stairs zigzagged up the metal frame, most solid but some corroded and wobbling. There were spots where the bolts had rusted through, and the steps wobbled dangerously beneath their feet. The vertical ladder section near the top was the most terrifying, 20-some feet of straight climbing with nothing but a narrow metal cage for protection. The adrenaline rush was insane. When they reached the cab at the top, a small square room with windows on all 4 sides, the view was absolutely breathtaking. They could see for miles in every direction. Miles and miles of forest, unbroken and wild, stretching to the horizon. The sun was maybe 1 hour from setting. They had timed it perfectly. Their plan was to camp out for the night and catch the sunrise. There was a decently wide wraparound walkway up there. They cracked open a few beers and just enjoyed the view and some conversation. The sun eventually went down and the sky transformed from orange to purple to dark blue in a matter of minutes. Once the light was gone, the forest below them was just a black void in every direction. There wasn't a single light in sight. The stars emerged, brilliant and numerous, the most spectacular either of them had ever witnessed. But for Marcus, being suspended 70 feet above a forest he couldn't see was deeply unsettling. It was weird not being able to see anything, despite knowing there was a whole forest below them. Charles could tell Marcus was getting antsy and started messing with him, grabbing his shoulder, making jokes, but then Charles did something that would set everything in motion. He smacked his metal water bottle against the side of the tower. The sound was incredible, loud, echoing. The noise reverberated through the forest in every direction, probably audible for miles. It was so loud and ominous that Marcus actually got angry. He told Charles to get inside the cab. Charles finished his beer and was about to join him when he called Marcus back outside. His voice was different this time. Serious, uncharacteristic. Very un-Charles-like. Come back out here. Marcus obliged and found Charles pointing diagonally downward at the forest below. There was a light down there, faint, far away, but unmistakably present. And it was weaving through the forest at what appeared to be a steady walking pace. Marcus's immediate thought: someone had heard the clanging sound. They were coming to investigate. They were about to get caught or arrested. But Charles gave him a strange look. You think that's a person? What else would it be? That light is moving too? Evenly, Charles said. Look at it. It's not swinging or wobbling the way you'd expect someone carrying a lantern or flashlight to be. It's moving perfectly, like it's floating. Charles was right. The light was moving with unnatural smoothness, like it was hovering, like it was being carried by something that wasn't human. Marcus didn't say anything after that. Neither did Charles. They just kept staring at this mysterious light as it continued weaving through the forest. Part of Marcus thought it was just some random hiker that had nothing to do with them, but he knew that was wishful thinking. After a few minutes, it was obvious that the light was getting closer. It was also much clearer that the light was moving perfectly, like it was floating or hovering. Charles asked Marcus what they should do, and Marcus didn't have an answer. There wasn't really anything they could do. What were they going to do? Climb down in the dark? As they were throwing out theories, the light suddenly zipped forward like it skipped a beat. For a split second, that light went from steady, even movement to an abrupt zip forward. Then it was back to steady movement again. Marcus felt his palms start to sweat. He could tell Charles was really freaked out too. They kept trying to convince themselves that whoever was down there was just wandering aimlessly through the woods. But again, wishful thinking. The light was definitely heading for the tower. After about 10 minutes, the light reached the base of the tower and stopped. From their vantage point, straight above, they could see the light itself, but not whoever was holding it. It just stayed in that exact spot right below them. Charles and Marcus stared at it. The suspense was killing Marcus, but it must have been killing Charles even more because he again did something Marcus wanted to throw him off the tower for. Charles actually yelled, "Hey, are you good?" down at the light, revealing their presence. Marcus looked at him in horror. He genuinely couldn't believe Charles would do something so stupid. They didn't get a response. The light didn't even move. They waited a little bit, and then Charles yelled down again. Still nothing. So there they were, 70 feet up in an abandoned fire tower in the middle of nowhere with someone or something blocking their only exit. They were completely trapped. They must have watched that light for 30 minutes straight, whispering to each other every so often. It never moved once. Marcus wasn't worried about being secretive anymore. Charles had burned that bridge a long time ago, so Marcus did something he should have done a while ago. He grabbed his flashlight and aimed it straight down at the base of the tower. But even after he did that, he still couldn't see the source of the light. The darkness below was absolute. Eventually, they accepted that there was nothing they could do and tried to go back to what they were doing. They went back to talking, but Marcus made sure he never took his eyes off that light for more than a few seconds. Charles thought it was some kind of LED that someone had placed there to mess with them. But who the hell would bother doing that? At some point, Charles said he was going to climb down and check it out. Marcus told him that was insane. Not only was that inviting trouble, but it was downright stupid and dangerous. As they were arguing about it, Marcus glanced down and realized that he couldn't see the light anymore. There was just darkness and more darkness down there again. Marcus frantically scanned the emptiness below them with his eyes, looking for the light. But it wasn't there anymore. Charles seemed relieved, but Marcus was the opposite. He kept telling Marcus to relax, saying whoever had been there had probably left. But Marcus was more freaked out than he had been when the light was just sitting there motionlessly. The thought that someone could be down there, and now they couldn't even see them, was terrifying to Marcus. What if they were climbing? What if they were already on their way up? Charles reassured Marcus that they'd obviously be able to hear if anyone tried to climb the ladder. Which was true, Marcus guessed. But he was still really unsettled. Suddenly, Marcus didn't want to be in the open air anymore. He suggested that they wait out the rest of the night from inside the cab. Charles agreed immediately. They went inside and set up their sleeping bags. Neither of them were going to sleep, though. That would be suicide. Staying awake turned out to be the right decision. Not 20 minutes after going inside, they started hearing noises. The first ones were all metallic clangs that echoed up through the steel frame of the tower. They weren't footsteps. Marcus was listening specifically for footsteps, and this was not that. It sounded more like someone struck one of the support beams with a wrench or a crowbar. A few minutes later, another one came. This one was more of a grinding sound, like metal being twisted against metal, and it lasted for a good few seconds before stopping. Charles and Marcus kept looking at each other like they were expecting the other one to do something, but there was nothing they could do. The sounds kept coming from what sounded like different spots. That's what really got Marcus, because it meant whatever was causing them was moving around down there. The sounds continued on and off for hours. Marcus kept trying to map them out in his head, figure out where they were coming from, how many sources there were, whether they were getting closer or staying at the same level. He couldn't make sense of any of it. Charles and Marcus were whispering to each other about what they'd do if they started hearing someone walking up the ladder. Marcus was sitting against the far wall of the cab, facing the windows on the opposite side. Charles was on the opposite side, looking over Marcus's shoulder. There were so many windows in there that they didn't feel safe. They wanted to be able to see out of all of them. There wasn't much to see, though. The windows were all dark, with only light from the stars and the moon. But then Marcus saw something. A dark outline moved across the glass. Marcus's brain couldn't process what he was seeing fast enough, but then it passed in front of the next pane, and that's what did it. There was something outside the cab. Marcus couldn't help but yell, and Charles scrambled away from the window. Both of them immediately ran over to the door and pressed their backs against it. If something tried to come through that door, it was going to have to push through both of them. Marcus kept looking for the figure through the windows, but he couldn't see anything. That was impossible, though. Unless it was crawling on all fours, he should have been able to see it. Charles and Marcus sat up like that for a really long time. Marcus could hear Charles hyperventilating beside him. What followed was the most tense and terrifying few hours of Marcus's life. They sat there in that exact position like their lives depended on it. By the time the sun started coming up, Marcus was completely exhausted. When it was finally light enough to see, he counted to 3 and then swung the door open violently, expecting someone to be crouching behind it. But there was no one there. Charles and Marcus ran around the side of the cab to confirm that. It was clear. Completely clear. They looked down to the base of the tower. There was nothing down there either. No person, no equipment, no evidence of the previous night's activity. They grabbed their stuff and started descending as quickly as they could. They were desperate to get out of that tower and get away from whatever had been down there. They made it about 3/4 of the way down the staircase before Charles stopped in front of Marcus. He just stood on the landing, staring down at the next section of stairs. Marcus looked past him and saw it immediately. An entire section of the staircase was gone. It wasn't just a few steps. Marcus is talking about an entire section of stairs. A whole chunk of the staircase was missing. It was impossible, but they were staring at it. Someone or something had deconstructed an entire section of staircase during the night while they were sitting directly above them. That must have been what those metallic sounds were, but that didn't make sense. The noises didn't stop until after Marcus had seen the figure outside the window. So had they really crossed that gap twice in the dark? No way. Plus, there's absolutely no chance someone could have done that without them hearing it. That would have been a lot louder than a few clangs and grinding sounds. They stood on that landing for a while trying to figure out what to do. They had to just jump across. It wasn't that far, but it was still scary, and they were both exhausted and terrified. Charles ended up twisting his ankle on the jump, but they both made it across. They made it the rest of the way, down, and that was that. There was no one waiting for them at the bottom. There was actually nothing there at all. Not even the metal steps that had been removed. Granted, they didn't look around too much. Didn't make any sense, but they weren't sticking around. To this day, Charles and Marcus still don't have an explanation for the light, the sounds, the figure outside the window, or how someone managed to remove an entire section of steel staircase in the middle of the night without them hearing it. Every time they see each other, this is something they still talk about. Case 3. The Hunted Camper. Our final case brings us back to present day. A man in his late 30s, a seasoned camper with nearly 15 years of solo wilderness experience. A man who knows the risks and takes precautions. A man who carries a rifle. 2 years ago, this individual, let's call him Marcus, decided he needed time away. Work had been difficult. His mental health was suffering. He needed 3 nights in the wilderness. No people. No distractions, just silence and solitude. He drove to the Daniel Boone National Forest in eastern Kentucky on a Thursday morning. The forest spans over 700,000 acres. If you know where to go, you can hike for days without seeing another human being. Marcus knew where to go. He parked at a trailhead off a Forest Service road and started hiking. The plan was simple: 3 nights in the backcountry. That was pretty much it. He had his tent, his pack, enough food and water for 4 days, and his 308 bolt action rifle that he always brings on solo trips. Day 1 was exactly what he needed. He covered about 7 miles before finding a flat spot near a creek bed that looked like a good place to camp. He set up his tent, gathered some wood, and had a fire going by the time the sun started going down. He cooked some food, drank a beer, and slept by the fire until it burned down to embers. The whole time, he didn't see a single person. He fell asleep around 10 p.m. He woke up at some point in the middle of the night. He's not sure what woke him. It was more like his brain just switched on for no reason, the way it does sometimes when you're sleeping somewhere unfamiliar. He lay there for a minute and stared at the ceiling of his tent. But as his eyes adjusted, he noticed something. There was a faint orange glow coming through the walls of his tent. He unzipped the tent flap and looked out. Maybe 200 yards away through the trees, there was a fire. Not a big one. It was about the size of a campfire, but it was definitely there. It was flickering, which is how he knew it was a fire. He watched it for a few minutes, waiting to hear talking or something. He wanted to confirm it wasn't some random forest fire. But after a while of looking at it, he couldn't see or hear anything beyond the fire. He watched it a little while longer just to see if it would grow out of control, but it didn't. He figured it was another camper set up nearby that he just hadn't noticed during the day. It wasn't impossible, especially since he had gone to sleep relatively early. He figured whoever it was had gone to sleep and left their fire going, which is irresponsible but not uncommon. He watched it for about 5 more minutes and then zipped his tent back up and went to sleep. It didn't bother him too much. When he woke up the next morning, the fire was the first thing he thought about. Not because it had scared him, but because he was curious. He wanted to see who else was out there, maybe say hi, but mostly to satisfy his curiosity. He packed up his campsite and hiked in the direction where the fire had been. It took him about 10 minutes to reach the area. He was pretty confident he had the right spot. There was a natural clearing that lined up with the angle he'd been looking from. But when he got there, he stopped. There was no fire pit, nor was there a ring of stones, no pile of ash, no scorched ground, no charred wood, nothing. The ground was completely undisturbed. He walked the whole clearing, checking for any sign that someone had been there. But there were no signs of life whatsoever. The area was pristine, as if no one had visited in months. He stood there for a while, genuinely confused. He was certain he'd seen a fire. It had been a campfire burning clearly for at least 5 minutes while he watched it. And yet the ground, where it should have been, looked like no one had set foot there in months. He considered the possibility that he had the wrong spot, but there wasn't another clearing anywhere near the right distance or direction. There wasn't much he could do beyond that, though. So he just moved on. He still had 2 more nights planned. He wasn't about to cut his trip short over something silly like that. He hiked for most of the day. The terrain changed as he moved deeper into the forest. The creek bed fell away behind him and the ground started climbing. By mid-afternoon, he was in a denser, older section of the forest, where the trees were taller and the canopy was thick enough to block out most of the sky. It was quieter in there, which was nice. He found a good campsite around 4 p.m. and set up for the night. That evening was uneventful. He doused his fire a little after 9 p.m. and turned in for the night. He doesn't know what time it was when the sound woke him up, but it was loud enough to pull him out of a dead sleep. He woke up to this distant, enormous cracking sound, like a thick branch being snapped in half, except it kept going. It was violent, and it lasted for maybe 3 or 4 seconds. At the tail end of it, there was a deep, resonant thud that he could quite literally feel in the ground beneath him. A tree had fallen somewhere deeper in the woods, or at the very least, a very large branch. If you've ever heard the sound of a tree falling before, which he understands is kind of a rare occurrence, it's amazing and terrifying at the same time. It didn't scare him per se, but the deafening force and scale of it gave him a crazy adrenaline rush. He lay there in his sleeping bag, trying to figure out what had just caused it. The more he thought about it, the less sense it made. It wasn't storming. There was barely any wind. There was nothing he could think of that would have brought a tree down on a night like this. But there was also nothing he could do. He couldn't fall asleep at that point either. His heart was still racing, and the adrenaline had him awake. So he just closed his eyes and waited for it to wear off. But then not 10 minutes later, it happened again. Only this time, it was much louder. That same gruesome crackling sound, followed by a crash of branches and a deafening thud. But this one was close. Not right on top of him, but close enough that the sound was almost disorienting. And it came from a completely different direction than the first one. The first tree had fallen somewhere to the south. The second one was to his northwest. He sat up immediately. Now he was actually scared. 2 trees falling on the same night in 2 different parts of the forest with no wind and no storm. That was inconceivable. He kept trying to come up with an explanation that made sense. The most logical thought was that the first one had caused some kind of chain reaction. But that hypothesis didn't account for the fact that the trees fell in completely different parts of the forest. Whatever brought down the first tree had nothing to do with the second one. They were 2 different events, but that was even more inconceivable. He was sitting there, processing all this when he heard something new. Something that took his fear from a moderate 5 to a resounding 10. It was this low and continuous rumbling sound, a cross between a groan and a growl, like a person clearing their throat, except it didn't stop. It went on and on. It wasn't an animal sound he recognized. He's heard bears, he's heard elk, he's heard bobcats. This wasn't any of those. It sounded like something was making the noise on purpose, and it went on for what felt like a full minute without any break or variation. He did the only thing he could think to do. He grabbed his rifle, chambered around as quietly as he could, and aimed it at the tent flap. At that point, he was full on panicking. He must have sat like that for 20 minutes. The sound eventually tapered off. It didn't stop abruptly. It kind of faded out like whatever was making it had moved further away. And just like that, the forest was quiet again. He didn't sleep the rest of the night. He doesn't think he would have been able to if he tried. It was the worst night of his life. As soon as he saw daylight, he got out of the tent. He packed up as quickly as possible, still spooked and extremely unsettled despite being able to see. Once everything was in his pack, he started walking in the direction of the second tree, the louder and closer one. He needed to see it, if only to confirm that he hadn't imagined the whole thing. He had his rifle ready in his hands. He found the tree after about 10 minutes. The thing was massive, and its trunk was lying at an angle across a shallow slope. Broken branches and debris were scattered all around it. So it was real? He really couldn't believe it. He'd been trying to convince himself he had just imagined everything from the night before. But there it was. He needed to keep investigating. He wouldn't have been satisfied leaving without knowing what had caused the fall. He walked over the stump, which was about 3 feet high. The wood where it had broken was pale and fresh, but the break wasn't clean. It wasn't the kind of jagged, splintered fracture you get from wind stress or root failure. The wood around the break point had been torn apart in a way that he had never seen before. Parts of the stump looked like they'd been gouged. There were long, irregular grooves running through the wood at different angles. It looked like some of them were up to an inch deep at least. The wood genuinely looked like it had been stripped and chewed rather than cut or snapped. The more he looked, the more he noticed. Some of the bark around the base had been peeled away in long strips. The exposed wood underneath had that same gouged, chewed-up look. He couldn't pretend he knew what he was looking at because he didn't. He'd seen beaver damage before, and this was not that. Beavers leave clean cuts. He'd seen woodpecker damage, and this wasn't that either. This was aggressive, messy, and covered way too much surface area to be any animal he could think of. The tree hadn't fallen because it was dead. It hadn't fallen because the wind knocked it over. Something had worked on that trunk with tremendous force until it came down. And suddenly he felt this really nasty feeling in his gut. He needed to leave. He stopped examining the tree and started backing away. But as he was turning to leave, something near one of the tree branches caught his eye. There was a small cluster of items sitting on the ground. If it weren't for the fact that they looked man-made, he wouldn't have even bothered checking them out. But as soon as he saw what they were, he felt his blood run cold. It was a blue bandana and a carabiner. They were both his items. He instantly started digging through his pack and confirmed those 2 items were missing. In that moment, he grabbed his stuff, shoved it in his backpack, and ran. He didn't know if running was the right decision. He didn't know if that would have attracted attention to him. But he did anyway. He just needed to get out of those woods. He got tired after a while under the weight of all his stuff, but he moved as fast as he could. The hike back took him most of the day. The entire time he felt like he was being stalked or watched. He felt like something was going to jump out from somewhere any second. He kept his rifle in his hands the entire time. He made it back to his car around 3 p.m. in the afternoon. He drove out of there so fast, despite his exhaustion. The first thing he did when he got to a safe distance away was call the police. He doesn't think they took him very seriously, but he didn't care. He also knew there probably wasn't much they could do, but he didn't care about that either. He was pretty messed up for days afterward. None of it made any sense whatsoever. What he couldn't get over was the fact that his stuff had been rummaged through. Something had either stalked him through the woods or knew where he was the entire time. That unexplainable fire from the first night must have had something to do with it. There's no way that was a coincidence. Those trees. He still has no explanation for what could have cut them down. He genuinely doesn't think it was anything human. But as for what animal it could have been, he has no idea. He still goes camping, believe it or not. But this is something that he thinks will hang over him forever. Something that changed how he sees the wilderness. Something that makes him question what's really out there in the deepest, most remote parts of our world. These 3 cases represent just a fraction of the unexplained encounters we receive each week. Every single day, people experience something in the wilderness that defies rational explanation, something that authorities won't investigate, something that they're too afraid or too skeptical to believe. But you know the truth. You know that our world is stranger and more dangerous than we've been told. You know that there are places where the rules of civilization don't apply. You know that some encounters change lives forever. This is why silent fear exists. We investigate the cases that others ignore. We document the stories that demand to be heard. We bring you the truth when everyone else is looking away. If you've experienced something unexplainable, whether in the wilderness or anywhere else, we want to hear from you. Drop your story in the comments below. Tell us what you saw. Tell us what you experienced. Tell us what changed your understanding of our world. If this video has affected you, if it's made you question what's out there, do 3 things. First, like this video. It helps us reach more people who need to know the truth. Second, comment your own experiences. Share your story. Let others know they're not alone. Third, subscribe to Silent Fear and hit that notification bell. We upload new investigations every week and you won't want to miss a single one. Because the truth is out there and we're going to find it. We're going to expose it. We're going to make people listen. This is Silent Fear. Where mysteries become reality, where the unexplained becomes documented, where we refuse to accept the easy answers. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for believing. And thank you for being part of this community of truth seekers. Stay vigilant, stay skeptical, stay safe. And remember, not everything has an explanation. Some encounters are meant to remind us that we're not alone in this world. And some forests keep their secrets.